Um, and we're a small group, so I don't think I'm going to mute us, but if I need to mute you all, I will do that. If you want to mute yourself, that's fine if you know you're in a noisy environment, which looks like most of you think you are. And today we are having Shane Neumeier, who is got tremendous background. I mean, I read her resume and I was like, whoa, this is great. But she is a neurodiverse lawyer. I mean, I know there's probably lots of lawyers at neurodiverse because I think it probably attracts people who are into doing research. But the work that she's done has been extremely important to the disability community. And it's thank you, Lydia. Is that Lydia? I just see the question there.
Yeah.
I just
Thanks,
see
Lydia.
I see the comment, but I don't see who wrote it. But has worked in the work to get the rights of folks, that people who are transgendered and who are LGBT have their rights respected under the law, and important work that most of us are not as aware of as we should be, and what some of the consequences, I don't know if consequences is the right word, some of the issues that come up for people who are not cisgendered, that there are rights that are constantly being violated. And sometimes some of those violations entail being treated medically in ways that are simply wrong. You have your gender and your disability gets medicalized and considered to be something that's wrong with you that must be cured. And the mental health industry has made a lot of money off of making our mental health into a system. And Shane is one of those people who is helping make sure that our rights are taken care of and respected. Ready to start?
I am. Thank you. So, hi, I'm Shane. As was noted, my pronouns are they, them, and theirs. And I hope that everybody's doing as well as you can under the current conditions of pandemic, among other things. I actually don't know who all is here as far as how many people are self-advocates or community members versus how many people are service providers or family members. So if some people are saying, hey, like, this doesn't apply to me, or alternately, like, why are you telling me this? I already know all this, then excuse me. I will try to keep in mind that my audience is kind of generic. I know a few of you, but that's it. But to start with, the reason why I care about this topic so much is that topic being, if you somehow stumbled into this conversation without knowing, is about coercive medical treatment, is because my life has pretty much been shaped by it. It started with it from the very first moment, but there was medically necessary treatment I experienced as a very young person, and then there were things that were probably necessary but mishandled in a way that could have been done much better, in a way that respected my bodily autonomy and my mental state and my future mental health. And then there were things that were not necessary, or at least weren't necessary at that time in that way, and that could have been provided without coercion on my own timetable, or if I chose to, not at all. And in some cases, I eventually did choose to not go through with things myself. And unfortunately, some of the effects of coercive treatment have been other disabilities. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the main one I can think of, related to medical treatment. And it's also and it took me a long time to engage with treatment that I felt later on could have been useful to me. I might not have needed it when it was first imposed on me, and I probably needed it sometime before I ended up seeking it out. But in the interim, I wasn't able to access it because my associations were about losing control, about it being as bad as it was, thinking that, accurately or not, something that was bad when it was forced on me would be bad when I was choosing it. And from what research I've done now, more recently, I know that those two are not the same experiences at all, and context can shape how painful and traumatizing things are a lot. And also just how it affects the person even beyond that immediate visceral sense of fear and terror. Just the idea I grew up with that my family members, for instance, didn't think I was good enough as I was. I needed to be fixed. The people around me didn't think it was worth defending me against harm being done by other people. They thought that if they changed me, if they put me through things that were painful, that were risky, that other people would stop hurting me, and then I would be worth not hurting anymore. That arguably helps contribute to yet another disability of depression. So, and the coercive treatment I'm talking about that I experienced, the big one was surgical interventions. Namely, they broke my jaw and put it back together, and it was immensely painful. I would go through brain surgery and a mastectomy all over again any day, and never do brain and never do jaw surgery again if for whatever reason I was put with that choice before me. I was also put on many medications. Sorry, there was echo. I was also put on a number of psychiatric medications as a young person, starting at the age of 9, with an antipsychotic called Risperdal and an antidepressant called Wellbutrin, which caused my one and only grand mal seizure of my entire life. And the next 6 years was a series of medication trials that would have me up all night long, having weird vision of scary things one week, and then unable to pick myself off the bed the next week. And all of this was more to do with my context than who I was as a person. I mean, I was a strange-looking kid with a number of undiagnosed, mostly mental, but also a few perceptual or sensory disabilities, troubles at home that were not my fault, and the way that other people, including my school authorities and including my doctors, looked at it was, if there's a problem, it must be with a disabled kid. So they tried to medicate that. It didn't work. And finally, there are some other procedures that I went through that were not quite surgical, but I would have much preferred that they be surgical in the sense of being put under anesthetic for them. I will not go into the gory or graphic details, but they were incredibly invasive, and in any other context, they probably would have been considered child sexual abuse. And the main one I'm thinking of is, and there were multiple instances of that happening, and I only remember one time for certain, were all when I was very young, and it's very strange to not know how that affected me, to have that happen while my mom was in the room watching. I can't say that that's not by itself its own whole panoply of issues, aside from everything else. Now, I've gone on this long tangent about my background, and I hope everybody's not going, oh God, this person's crying about, oh, poor me. I would say that I had it solidly in the middle of experiences. I'm probably within that 40–60% range of suck. There's people who have never had anything worse than maybe a blood test that they didn't want to go through. And there's definitely people who have not even been lucky to have blood tests that they wanted. I would, I'll leave that for later. And then there are people who, for instance, are committed to institutions for decades upon decades, sometimes their entire lives or their entire childhood, and written off as people medicated against their will for convenience of staff, for instance, restrained. And in the advocacy I've done the most work on, the cause, I guess you could say, there are some people who are electrically shocked as punishment as a form of behavior modification for manifestations of their disabilities, namely autism and psychosocial disabilities, in a facility in Massachusetts, which still exists and is still allowed to do this somehow, which is its own very long story. So looking at my own experience and situations like that, and situations like the so-called troubled teen industry, where you, in the words of one person whose work I very much respect, ship your kid off to Utah to be tortured at boot camps or emotional growth schools or other facilities where they basically put people through what is the same techniques they use in cult initiation and interrogations to modify their behavior, generally because of responses to grief or family troubles, or they're struggling in school, or they're having addiction issues. There's a whole industry, unfortunately, of places, especially in Utah and the Pacific Northwest, that use psychologically damaging techniques to modify children's behavior, generally to quote unquote fix a kid's bad behavior. I looked at those two situations and others like it, and that's what I decided to work on as far as my career, I guess you could say, to process it. So I could just turn this into a long list of horror stories, and there is a part of me that's very tempted to do so, because God knows there's enough to fill 2 hours or 5 hours or 12 hours, and just from what I know, but I won't. I guess the other side to look at this here is, why do people decide to put others through coercive care, either on an individual level, like a parent or a caregiver, or on a social level or societal level, like a government that allows for a system of state schools, for instance, or psychiatric hospitals with commitment for long term. And I say this not to say, oh, we have to understand them and that they have our best interests at heart. I mean, I believe that they believe they do, but I also think that there's multiple factors, and the purpose of understanding the motivations behind it is to be able to better address it. I have seen or listened to a number of things where I feel like the authors or the creators had the right general perspective, but they made the doctors or the government, the oppressive government, just so evil that it wasn't believable as to why they were making these decisions that harmed people. And I think to be able to understand these dynamics, it does make sense to look at the reasons why. And it can range from, sorry, that threw me off a bit. It can sometimes be purely selfish motives or largely selfish motives. For instance, there are a number of parents in the troubled teen facility world where it was a matter of their child wasn't living up to what they expected. They wanted a certain kind of kid. They didn't get a certain kind of kid. They had a kid who turned out to have a tendency towards addiction and then developed addiction. They had a kid who wasn't doing well in school or was going out with people they didn't approve of, and they felt that that was a problem that needed to be fixed. Unfortunately, for instance, one of the heads or upper people in one of these facilities actually said, our parents, the parents send kids to us like they want, I'm sorry, I'm blanking out. They compared what they were doing to making a pizza, making the pizza in the form of a kid that the parents wanted. And I do think that there is a large part, especially when it comes to young people, where it can be about what the parents want, what they expected out of the parent-child relationship, or what they expected their child to be, what experiences they feel it's important for their child to have or not have. And it can be about them, purely about them. It can also be a matter of, I would want this if I were this person, and an inability to separate themselves from another person. That can definitely be part of it. Often the more general societal justification you'll hear is public safety. I think especially of all the arguments about mass shooting being allegedly caused by people with psychosocial disabilities. First of all, that's spunk. The research out there, one, shows that neurodivergent people aren't inherently more likely to be violent than neurotypical people. And if anything, the research shows that we are more likely to be victims of violent crime than perpetrators. But that takes away from a narrative that allows us to write off people who do terrible things as outliers and not as parts of a broader pattern that would maybe inform policy, such as depending on their gun control or addressing white supremacy or any number of other factors that would require more effort and introspection than simply locking up all the crazies. So we can't be having that kind of nuance, can we? But the public safety justification also gets used to a lesser extent. It can also be used to justify other forms of incarceration, such as in rehabs, if people believe that drug use is inherently wrong, such that people should be committed to a rehab if they have an addiction. As you might be able to imagine, I don't agree. And let me catch up with my thoughts here. Sorry. It can even the direct belief that somebody will cause harm, direct physical harm to others, but a belief about norms and maybe morals, but maybe just how people should behave because that's how it is. This justifies two kinds of coercive treatment, or usually coercive treatment, that are historically linked, oddly enough. One of which, more commonly known probably in the mainstream dialogue, is called conversion therapy or reparative therapy, usually designed to make gender nonconforming and or gay people, and usually younger people, be straight and cisgender and gender conforming. Thankfully, a number of states have outlawed this practice, and the number is growing. I would hope to see a general ban, but that's probably a longer time coming. The other of these two interventions is much more widely respected within medical psychological circles. It's called applied behavioral analysis, and it's the leading therapy or intervention for autism. It's considered the evidence-based gold standard, and the goal of it, depending on who you ask, is to build skills, and skills are left unspecified, or to make an autistic person act more neurotypically, which is a more honest description of it. This can include, for instance, requiring an autistic person to not move their hands, not flap their hands or vocalize repeatedly, not do things that would code as autistic or otherwise not normal. It can involve forcibly exposing somebody to a sensory aversion and not allowing them to leave the situation, in hopes that they will acclimate to it or get used to it. One of the more egregious examples of that I came across, and unfortunately it stuck with me because of a similar experience in a different context, is a young person who was made to eat something that they had a sensory aversion to, as is very common to autistic people. We have taste, texture, smell aversions. And the person, as one would imagine, if you know anything about sensory aversions, vomited onto themselves and was left to sit in their own vomit while the therapist walked out of the room as a consequence for having an automatic physiological reaction. And sometimes it's what might be called soft aversives, of you don't get to talk about your favorite thing that means the world to you until you engage in these behaviors we want 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for the entire day. Or you don't get to keep your comfort stuffed animal or object with you. You have to earn it by doing these things that you consider unpleasant. And for a normal child, this would already be an unpleasant thing. For an autistic child, where that kind of stability and grounding and that kind of familiarity with something is crucial, and not only comforting, but really in a chaotic, overwhelming world, like one thing to cling to for safety. It can be, it feels dramatic to say traumatizing, but it really can be, especially as used. And a lot of people will say that ABA, applied behavioral analysis, is not done in the way it used to be, where used to be can mean anything from the days where they used to literally use electric cattle prods on disabled people, which is only done in one facility now, to any period in the more recent past where the use of the phrase quiet hands, for instance, meant to train people out of flapping their hands was a routine thing. I'm not at all convinced that it's still not a widely spread practice to stop people from engaging in stimming, but that's a different story. But the goals of ABA haven't changed. They haven't changed from making a person be what neurotypical adults deem more functional within a neurotypical adult framework, rather than how to be a successful autistic person and a happy autistic person who is living the life towards the goals they want to live. And I'll go back to the part where I mentioned that these two are historically linked, because the literature, if you go back to look at the first study of conversion therapy, as it's called, it was written by two people. One, the founder of ABA, Ivor Lovis, and two, a guy who would later go on to become yet another one of the closeted homophobes, who ended up being caught in the act. But Ivor Lovis was involved in that study, which led to a young man being punished physically for engaging in feminine behaviors. And he did end up being gay, and he also ended up killing himself later because of what he was put through as an experiment. And unfortunately, many young autistic people have come out the other side of ABA with PTSD because of the similar experience of being put in stressful situations, being punished if they try to cope in the way that makes sense for them, and being punished for reactions of not being able to cope when their coping mechanisms are taken away, when those coping reactions, when those reactions don't match up to what they're expected to do without those other ways of handling it. If it sounds a little like the concept of learned helplessness in psychology, that's because it is. This can range in effects from people having more what you might call behavioral outbursts, becoming more violent or aggressive against or even violent and aggressive when they weren't before, because they have reached a point of their trauma response being fight, or unfortunately there's many cases in which people come out of this having learned that they don't have the right to say no. And what does that set you up for? If you have been told that your boundaries don't count and that you're wrong, as one person who went to that most extreme behavioral modification program that uses electric shock said in public testimony once, that she came out of that facility and got into an abusive relationship almost right away. And the two are directly connected, because the program, by punishing him for behaviors related to his disability, told him that he deserved to be heard and that he didn't have any right to say no. Sorry, one sec. The other aspect of this, and I guess it goes to a whole different range of policy justifications or personal justifications for coercive care, is I would argue that lack of access to care is coercive itself. If you can't access treatment you don't want to, that you want to have, that's a violation of your bodily autonomy just the same. The most obvious example I can think of this at this moment is the issue, and unfortunately this has become even more likely in the recent past, of autistic people being denied gender-affirming care when they are transgender, on the basis that because they're autistic, they don't understand gender and they're easily influenced, and therefore that a bunch of autistic people will be suckered into undergoing transition care because they're too naive or whatever. I mean, first, as an autistic trans person, bullshit. One, I did not get hormones the day I walked into a doctor's office, and it took a year and a half of actively seeking a double mastectomy to get one, plus a lot of financial troubles, but that's a different story. And second of all, it's incredibly ableist. First, to people, including but not limited to J.K. Rowling and Milo Yiannopoulos, who concern troll about autistic people, and especially autistic AFAB people, assigned female at birth people identifying as trans, of we need to protect the autistic girls. It's like, where the fuck were you when everything else was happening to autistic girls? Autistic girls are sexually abused regularly. Autistic girls are bullied. Autistic girls are abused by their parents for being autistic. Autistic girls and boys and non-binary people are subject to a huge range of harms because they're autistic that have nothing to do with transgender people or transgender health care. That's another dimension on which autistic trans and gender nonconforming people experience harm, but I do not hear a peep out of any of these people when it comes to anything that autistic people actually want to be protected from, which is very telling. And unfortunately, as with any other trans people, autistic people who are denied gender affirming care can experience bad mental health effects from it. And in one case that made the news, and I'm sure other cases that we don't know about, an autistic person was in mental health crisis because he couldn't get the gender affirming care from his provider, who said that he would need to be cured of autism, which isn't a thing that can happen, nor should it, in order to access hormone treatment. The cops were called on him while he was suicidal, and as the cops tend to do when called on suicidal people, they kill the person in the name of saving them, which makes sense in some parallel universe, I'm sure, but not this one. And all of that could have been prevented, this harm and harm in other kinds of cases, if the doctors had respected the person's own wishes about their body. Let them, even if you as a doctor think that they don't know what's good for them and they're making the wrong decision, you either can refer them to somebody else, or you can let them make their own mistakes, because it's ultimately their life. And if you have them sign the informed consent form and you've gotten out of liability, it's none of your business if they're making a decision that they want to make and you don't agree with. In general, it would help for providers to be better informed about disabilities in this and so many other ways. And I have given presentations like this, possibly less rambling, to providers, trying to inform them that there's a lot of things they could be doing better. But that's the way in which, or the example in which I'm seeing care being affirmatively denied. Now, there's also the way in which, at least in the US and countries that have followed its lead for whatever misguided reason, where people are denied care because they're poor, or because they're in that very wide and widening category of people who are not so very poor that they fall into the category of destitute, but nor are they actually able to afford health care. And that even if it's not coercive care on behalf of an individual provider who doesn't have the resources to treat somebody who can't pay, on a systemic level, on a societal level, it is coercive care or coercive violations of a person's bodily autonomy to make them die of insulin rationing. So part of a fight against medical abuse and coercive care would ironically perhaps be ensuring that everybody had access to care that they want to have, which I do fully believe is possible. And don't get me started on debunking all of the ridiculous reasons people are against a healthcare system better than GoFundMe. So people will ask, sometimes or often in bad faith, but sometimes in good faith, about what are the alternatives. So often this takes the form of, but what about the violent, crazy people who believe that the aliens in the television are telling them to shoot the president? Okay, first of all, I've represented 100 or more people who have been put in psychiatric hospitals, whether or not they're committed, and there has been exactly one person who has ever threatened a mass shooting, which is a thing that everybody, equates at this point with violent mental illness. And there was no indication that he would or could act on it, even outside of that context. There were a few people who had histories of violence, but they were not driven by their condition. As I will tell anybody who asks, asshole not otherwise specified is not actual DSM diagnosis. If you're a violent jerk, that's not necessarily because you have a mental illness. the two can coexist, but they're not inextricable. Most of the people, meanwhile, who I worked with were not violent at all. They hadn't been, they had no intention to be. And in many cases, I heard people saying, I was in my home or I was out and I was just picked up by the police. What happened? They were actively traumatized by that experience and had no understanding of why they had been detained, let alone any action that would have justified it. And so what I would say to that is that there doesn't have to be either no intervention at all, nothing done, just let the person go on a rampage or run out into traffic, or we medicate them and imprison them for having a condition. There are interventions in between that. First of all, going back to the idea that no care is coercive in its own way, put in place a voluntary system that anybody can access at any time. I don't think that even if I was okay with the idea of for psychiatric treatment in any case, I don't think that we can, as a society, allow that at all until we have voluntary care as an option. There should not be this choice of you either have to be forced to have treatment or you don't get any unless you're very rich. That's unacceptable. And there should be a wide variety of options out there, anywhere from you can get in to see a psychiatrist who can give you something that will help you immediately and then start you on something that will help long-term today, going into an urgent care clinic, for instance. Or you can go in, for instance, to, and there are some places that have programs like this, to a peer-run program where you can stay the night, be around other people who know what's happening. You have the right to leave at any time, but you can have people there to talk you down, to hold you accountable if you don't want to leave, to say, hey, you promised this. You can have a residential option that isn't coercive, and any number of other things that I could probably not list all the possibilities. There are other options that don't require somebody to be locked up. And if somebody is violent, deal with that as its own thing. I'm not saying, and I have problems with the criminal legal system all to itself, and I'm not saying lock people up without understanding of what's driving them, but address the violence and help people deal with that. Because often it's not just for the moment. They were fine before, and once they went crazy, they started wanting to kill people. Usually there's other things underlying. Address those. And hold people responsible for harm they do that's not disability related, and to the extent that there's still harm that they should be able to make up, even if it was disability related, do that in a way that's fair to help the victim, but not penalize the person and not put them under any more restrictions than they need to. And the other scenario I get very often is, okay, there is a 5-year-old who has a deadly disease. This disease will kill them. They need this treatment. They do not want this treatment because it hurts and it involves needles. What do you do? And this is a lot easier for me. I was that child. I did not like surgeries or blood tests, but around the age of 5 or 6, the earliest surgeries I can concretely remember, I understood that it wasn't an inevitability and it would help things like not getting ear infections, which sucked. I didn't want to go through it, but if I was going to go through it, I got to have some rules. I got to have some boundaries, and that's kind of the key thing. Give somebody the most control they can under the circumstances. Go out of your way to make them comfortable, to make the experience untraumatic as possible. Some things are very traumatizing, but even things that are seriously, they seem like they couldn't not traumatized person can be easier if you feel like you're in control of a person, because the core of trauma is a feeling of powerlessness, of helplessness, that you had no control and no agency. You were just an object that was acted on, no matter what you felt or how you were affected by it. So giving somebody a sense that their input matters, that they matter, they're not just a piece of meat on the operating table, as it were, can make all the difference. In my case, it was, you put the IV in after I'm under the mask, once I'm already asleep. You don't put it into my foot or my hand, you put it into my arm and nothing else. And I get to have my stuffed animal there. Those were my rules, and those were enough to make certain surgeries doable for me. I don't have traumatic memories of getting tubes put in my ear, even though I would have preferred to not undergo that, because to the extent possible, control was given to me over my situation. And this applies to, this isn't just me. I don't think I'm a special case of I was a particularly smart or insightful kid who deserved therefore to be treated with dignity. I think that's everybody. That's even people who can't articulate in words what they want can show through behavior, through other means of communication, what they want and what they need, and can be bargained with as far as how to get something that needs to be done to happen without completely depriving them of any control over their situation. I want to stop from there. One, because I've talked for about 45 minutes, and two, because frankly, I can't think of anything else I'd like to say. So if anybody would like to ask questions, feel free, or just make comments.
Shane, this is Lydia. Would you mind just putting your laptop on something stable? It's been shaking.
Sorry.
Shane, this is Lydia.
Yeah.
Since other folks are perhaps thinking of other questions they'd like to ask, you didn't talk about it a whole lot, but would you be able to speak about what you think a future would look like when the JRC is closed? What happens?
First of all, they're not going to other institutions, nor are any of the other people going to similar facilities, either whether we're talking specific to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, to people with who are in quasi criminalized contexts where it's kind of treatment, but really it's punishment. Instead of putting them into nicer institutions or institutions with nicer window dressing, to create the conditions that people can do well at home. And
excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but not everybody knows what facility you're talking about. Could you name it? Thank you.
To clarify, the Judge Rotenberg Center is the facility in Massachusetts that uses electric shock. They're one kind of behavior modification facility. They're not the only one, but they are, to my knowledge, the only one in the US that's been specifically cited by name or like targeted, denounced by the United Nations for torture. So that's a thing. So part of dealing with the aftermath of this would be to create real community-based services, not quasi-institutions like group homes where you're not, in a straitjacket in a bath ward, but you can't go outside and take a walk when you want, and the kitchen is locked outside of certain hours, and once in a while you go on a community visit where all of you get on a van and drive around the neighborhood with a staff member. No, you actually have access to your community and the supports needed to thrive there, which will of course be individualized. It'll also require parents, caretakers, and human services providers to have a different view of the people in their lives who they work with or take care of, who are their family members, and these are different changes in values needed sometimes. They're overlapping as far as what's considered normal or acceptable, and what needs to be changed versus what's okay. But some of it is, for instance, I feel like every parent of an autistic child, and really of a disabled child, needs to read Jim Sinclair's piece, Don't Mourn for Us, about the difference between a parent's grief over the expectations of a non-disabled child versus their, like, the worth or tragedy or lack thereof of their child's life, and the need to be able to see their child for what they are and create the best life for that child. And caregivers or who are not family members, educators, healthcare workers, etc., need to learn to see the people they're working with as not people they're making into a certain way, people to be controlled, but colleagues, people who you work with towards a common goal. And the goal needs to be, one, nobody gets to hurt other people, including the people in that relationship, but also other people. And besides that, the service recipient, the student, the person receiving medical care is the person whose goals need to be met. In whatever way does not hurt other people, and it's in the capability of that provider to give, that's the goal to be working towards. It feels very simple, but on the other hand, it requires a seismic shift in the values we have about children and families, about disability and what constitutes a good life, what people should want, what the norms of behavior are, what the roles of education and healthcare are. It's like, I've spent 10 years, and that's been a small part of the fight against just the Judge Rotenberg Center, and that's part of the larger problem of deinstitutionalization, or institutionalization and the need to deinstitutionalize, and that's part of the larger problem of addressing the conditions and beliefs that allowed for it in the first place.
You're muted. Susan, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. So I have a follow-up about JRC.
Yeah.
I've seen a number of videos about it, and I know there's no answer to this, but I cannot fathom how anybody can torture children the way they do there, and that parents put their children there, and that then they demand that their children stay there because they think it's actually benefiting them. I've been against, I mean, I've known about it a long time and been angry about it for a long time. And it just, nothing has changed my mind. I mean, everything I've read just makes it worse.
Oh yeah, that's the entirety of what the research I do into JRC and other behavior modification facilities. It's like, you think that eventually the rabbit hole of awfulness will just reach its end, and it never does. There's always something worse. But JRC is a little bit different than, say, the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs in Schools, which was the parent organization of such programs as Tranquility Bay, which is about as dystopian as the name might suggest, where they use tasers on young adults Programs like Tranquility Bay, Casa by the Sea, Mount Bachelor Academy, Provo Canyon, all of these programs, most of the people going there are upper middle class white kids whose parents are sending them there voluntarily, fully voluntarily, mind you. Parents or caregivers. JRC is a little bit different.
Isn't it only now in New York that can send people there? That Massachusetts now
the majority of people there are from, at JRC, are from New York, like 60+%. So if New York cut its funding, and it's state funding, that's the other thing. The vast majority of these placements are either through special education or through Medicaid. If you cut off state and federal money, JRC would be gone. The other thing about them is usually these are low-income families of color whose children are placed in schools that are not well-funded, not well-run. The kids are considered the problem children and are basically forced out, and their parents are told, your kid is going to go to this program where they're going to be in jail, homeless, drug addicted in the back ward of a psych unit where they'll be pumped full of antipsychotics, or they'll be dead. Like, and the parents are, it's voluntary and not voluntary. For one, they don't always know. And to some extent, I can say, okay, why didn't you just Google this place? If you had access to Google, that is, but there's a good chance most people do to some extent. There are other circumstances where I can see not doing the research, though it does frustrate me. The other aspect, though, is that they are getting pressure from the schools, the public schools, who don't want to deal with this kid anymore. Their kid is being funneled into the criminal system, which, at least on its face, sounds worse, that your kid is in jail. And often JRC, when it was still allowed to get new people onto the shock device, which it is not quite anymore, it's kind of complicated. They wouldn't start somebody off on the shock. They'll say, oh, no, that's a last resort. We do positive only first. We only do aversives when there's nothing else to be done. And of course, at its heyday, you know, over 200 of its 200+ students were on the shock device. So it's a combination of situational stressors from the start, and then the frog in the boiling pot situation where a person is in the situation and then it's like, oh no, we have to pursue this, and well, suddenly they're on the shock device 5 years, 10 years down the line. The other thing, though, as far as how people do it, how the people pushing the button, literally in this case, do it, I mean, there are disputes about the methodologies of both these experiments, and I feel like I need to do more research on the exact nature of them, but I just go back to the Stanford prison experiment and the Milgram experiment, which were done in the late and early 70s to explain how, actually, how the Nazis did what they did, how people commit genocide and atrocities. That was the background for both of these. But the Milgram experiment was where they had a bunch of people from the community around Yale come in for what was called a learning experiment, where they would be asked to pair up and test a person. One participant would be testing the other, and if the person got an answer wrong, they were supposed to push a button and it would give the person an electric shock. And every time they pushed the button, the voltage would go up a little bit, and they were instructed by the people running the experiment, keep pushing the button if they get it wrong, keep pushing the button. The other person, meanwhile, would often be screaming and saying, please no, I have a heart condition. They would be in clear distress. 67% of the people in that study pushed the button up to the highest level. They didn't stop. They would follow orders up to the point where it might be deadly to the person. It was revealed after the fact, meanwhile, that the people on the other end of the experiment, the quote unquote learners, were actually paid actors. They weren't being shocked. They were pretending, but the people doing the supposed shocking didn't know that. Stanford, meanwhile, on the other side of the country, there's a experiment where they took a group of college-age white men. All of them tested to be neurotypical as far as anybody could tell, just arbitrarily, you know, 1, 2, 1, 2, decided half of you are prisoners, half of you are guards, put them in the basement of a psychology department building in the on the Stanford campus, and had them basically role play prisoner and guard relationships. Within 4 days, the experiment needed to be shut down because the guards were being incredibly abusive. One of the people in the prisoners group had a mental breakdown. The psychologist running the study got caught up in basically enforcing order along with the prison guards. Was the warden, and he started to act like a warden, therefore proving his point. So I think when you take those two elements, the idea that an institutional situation where one group of people is put as having to control the other and given free reign, isolation in which to do what they want, combined with the tendency of people to obey orders even when they're harmful to people in their care or under their control. I mean, I think you put those two experiments together and you get the JRC.
Yeah. Wow.
There's a weird overlap, and this always seems to kind of get away from the main topics, but it's, you know, once you start researching facilities that do this, it gets you into all kinds of weird rabbit holes. There's a weird overlap between these facilities and interrogation techniques. Like if you read interrogation manuals from the CIA in the 60s, you get some of the same techniques that they use at behavior modification programs, like sleep deprivation and stopping people from going to the bathroom, food deprivation, sensory deprivation. You see the same things in cult initiations, and a lot of the programs that became part of the Troubled Teen Facility descended from actual cults. Synanon was one. The big one, and arguably the guy who started JRC was a failed cult leader who couldn't get adults to live with him in any of the 3 communes he started to create a behaviorist utopia, and I'm not kidding, that was his actual intent. He tried 2, 3 communes with adults. Nobody wanted to live under him, so he goes and works with disabled children who don't get a say in the matter. And a lot of the same research on cults and that shared these dynamics also apply to totalitarian governments. One of the psychologists who looked into some of this into what we would call brainwashing, which is a lot of the same behavior modification techniques, also did a study of Maoist China during the Cultural Revolution, and it's all the same thing. And it's, you know, once you start to put it together, it sounds like weirdo conspiracy theory stuff, but it's fascinating, and it just keeps getting darker the more you look at it.
I'm gonna let the sign language interpreter go. We have others with questions, comments?
Thank you for your work, interpreter person whose name I should have paid attention to and I did not, and I'm sorry, but thank you for your work.
Michelle, yes, I'll let her know.
And Emily is correct. They recruit former military and law enforcement people. That tells you a lot about what they think about their clients. Oh,
I thought that a year or two, maybe it was more than that, that they stopped allowing the shock of new people that were sent there, that it's only people who are existing quote unquote students could continue to be shocked. Is that true? I mean, reality, is that true, or is that
kind of. So there was a prospective ban on new people being shocked put into place in Massachusetts in 2011, but JRC has sued, and the trial court has found that the regulation is they struck down the regulation at the trial level. The state of Massachusetts is appealing now to uphold the regulation, but it's not resolved yet. Meanwhile, the Food and Drug Administration passed a regulation banning the shock device, but then quickly thereafter, this was earlier this year, said that they wouldn't be enforcing it during the pandemic and until any litigation arising from that, which is everybody knows will be coming. JRC will be suing the FDA to stop the enforcement until any litigation is resolved. So they can still shock people.
So you have a few comments that people have made. Let's see if I can go back. Well, there's an apology because somebody had to leave early, but they were out of spoons, but thank you very much. Once people are considered subhuman, any and all terrible tortures and punishments are considered in order, often for their own good, supposedly, or to control them, or just follow orders. Daniel Prude and Michael Hickson are both examples of that. And Michael Prude, I don't know if anybody's been following him, but a lot of new information came out just yesterday. A lot of the body cams that were taken while he was being tortured have come to light. It happened in March. It's taken this long for the body cams of the police to come to light, and it's pretty clear that this was.
Yeah, this is Elaine Kolb. I've been shaking all day. So it was good to have the earlier one where I got to sing because that helped. But watching the video of it, this was in Rochester, New York. The man, Daniel, was completely naked. It was snowing. His hands were cuffed behind his back, and they killed him anyway. And he was even praying for part of it and begging. This is what they do. It's.
You give people power and they become monsters.
I know it's not like it's anything new, but now sometimes because it's recorded, I mean, there's still nothing that's been done. You know?
Yeah, that's the infuriating thing. I mean, from where to kind of link the two discussions, back in 2012, when the footage of the shocks got released to the public in JRC, I thought, this is it. This is the moment where everybody sees, nobody can deny what happened. And, we did get some mileage on the advocacy side out of that video. Every time there's something, you just play that footage to show how bad it is. And yet, 8 years later, here we are, and the the government is still allowing them to use it, even though they decided to adopt the regulations, ban it after 6 years of deliberating. They're still saying, oh, we'll hold off on enforcing this. It's kind of like exposing it alone is not sufficient. And I think at a certain point, a lot of people, definitely not everybody, believed that this, you know, if people just knew how bad it was, it could be stopped, but that's just a small piece of it, unfortunately, and it's incredibly frustrating.
So what can people do that aren't directly involved? How can we make it known that this is not something we want?
Yes, Lydia put in the chat that it's important to say that they were Black men. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Part of the, I mean, I'm struggling these days to know what I should be doing as part of anything. So I kind of feel like too hard to be giving advice here. The part of it is just kind of watching what comes up, and any opportunity you have, when there's the opportunity, the spoons, and the interest to do something, whether it's writing a public comment or sharing something onto your page, or calling somebody about it, or writing an op-ed. It feels, you know, I know for me, I can feel like, that's it, that's what I can do. Oh crap. But those are options that one can take and hopefully make a dent over time, and with many other people making tiny dents as well. The other thing, though, I guess, to have narrower but possibly bigger impact is when you see situations like this in your own life with other people, to advocate for them, even when it's hard, knowing that it's worth the risk to help somebody access the treatment they want and exercise their autonomy when they don't want. Like, refer people, for instance, to resources, and you can find them by Googling about why applied behavioral analysis is harmful to autistic people. So you can share that to people who are saying, well, my kid's ABA is fine. Like, to be able to say, here are a bunch of autistic people and others saying that it's very much not fine. If you have a person who is, if you know a family that's struggling and they're thinking of sending their kid off to one of these facilities, to remember this and say, oh, no, maybe not. Look up this place, look at if they have any abuse complaints. What else is there that's closer to home and is not likely to try to skin? Like, advocate for the people in your life who might not be able to, even if they advocate for themselves, they might not be able to assert their autonomy, be the person who can get them the rest of the way there, so other people respect their boundaries. If nothing else, it'll help that person to know that somebody thinks they're worth sticking up for.
I remember a couple of years ago, Nancy Weiss in Syracuse University we put together a statement of solidarity against JRC. I remember signing it.
Yeah.
Does that kind of thing do any good? Or does it make us feel better?
I mean, depending on how it's publicized and to who, it can bring more attention to the issue, but like, it's, you know, if it's only within the disability community and only disability community people are seeing it, within the disability advocacy community, there might be people who won't take action against the JRC but know about it, but there's nobody who supports it, as far as I know. who say, yes, shocking a disabled person is a good idea. Treatment providers, maybe some, but within our own community, not so much. Maybe people aren't aware of it, so bringing it to their attention if they aren't can help. But it, and I say this not as criticism of you or anybody else, because I feel this way about a bunch of things I do, but it does kind of seem like what will make a dent. We can say this all we want, but somebody with power has to act on it.
Did you have any allies as a child? Anybody in your corner?
I'm sorry, what?
Did you have any allies as a child? Was there anybody in your corner, or did you feel totally on your own?
My best ally was another kid, well, a few other kids who were also disabled. We looked after each other. The person I'm thinking about was my ally because, well, among other reasons, he was the only person to stand up to my bullies, or one bully in particular, and throw the guy against the fence, at which point nobody messed with me after that while he was around. It also helped that I had a big dude who looked like he could give you trouble even if he was the gentlest guy in the world, and a girl who threw shoes at people's heads, including the principal if they pissed her off. So basically it was other disabled people who kept me safe. And I would like to think that I did something to return the favor now and again. But it was other people who were in the same position, which in a way makes it all the harder to understand why adults didn't do anything, because they had nothing to lose in the same way that a lot of us did.
Anyone else with other questions? I think we're all in sort of shock silence. I really, really, really appreciate everything you said tonight. I
Thanks.
appreciate your honesty, your openness. It was really important stuff to hear.
Thanks. I know it's kind of a downer thing, and I always get to be, what can you do thing, and it's like, oh crap, this doesn't lend itself to easy answers.
Well, I think that what it lends itself to is for us to remind ourselves and each other that everybody deserves to live a life with dignity and pride. And that includes all the people, starting with that as our basis and including everyone. See, they don't do these things to people that are in what is laughingly called the mainstream. It's the people on the fringes, it's the throwaways, it's the unwanted or the minorities, disadvantaged minorities. The advantaged minorities do fine, thank you very much. So I think it's really difficult to find the balance between being open to and aware of all the horrible stuff that's going on without getting sucked down into the quicksand of despair.
Yep.
And so for myself personally, that's why I keep singing. It helps me, and getting other people to sing along and have some fun sometimes, well, or to feel some power. I think that helps everyone. So whatever your passion is, what you can do, do it, and realize that we're in this together and we have to do it individually but also together.
I guess one other thing that you can do to probably to a larger extent than you could when I was a child, and maybe even when to a lesser extent that maybe slightly when Lydia, for instance, who is about a little less than 10 years my junior, was a kid, it's possible to let other people know that you exist. Both let other young people, younger versions of yourself, know that there are adults like them who have survived and come through and are willing to help them and stand up for them. And also to let people who, care providers and parents and educators, know that you are there. You're there to help, but you're also there and you've seen some shit. And there's stuff that shouldn't be repeated. There's both a message of you can be me, you can survive to adulthood and live the kind of life to whatever extent that you want to live, more than perhaps you've been told, as yourself, but also don't make them like me. I want better for them. You can do so much better, and here's how. So, like, letting people know you exist and what your experience is, and that you're there to support other people who are in the same situation, is a way, and it feels like such a small way to help, but it can.
Well, thank you again so very much.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, I don't know if I don't want to call it a pleasure, but but really, what you talked about is it's so important.
Thanks.
That's the truth.
I hope everybody else found it interesting, and I will see most of you around, probably at some point on the internet, if not in person in any time near to the near future.
Could you give us an internet address or a way to contact you?
So let me put it into text, because my name is what it is. I have 3 names that are, none of them are intuitively spelled unless you are fluent in languages that aren't English, namely German, Irish, and Yiddish. Despite the fact that I am a Gentile, my first name is Yiddish. But also you can find me on Facebook. Thankfully, I am the only Shane M. Newmeyer in the entire world, so you cannot make a mistake. If the JRC, anti-JRC button wasn't enough to let you know, there's literally no other people with that name.